The brass deadbolt was colder than the sea breeze rolling off the harbor, and as I slid my key into the cylinder, it wouldn't turn. I didn't force it. I just stood there on the porch of the coastal property I had spent the last 14 months restoring, listening to the distinct sound of a television playing inside. Through the front window, I could see my mother's beige cashmere coat draped over the back of the newly upholstered sofa. Sitting on the armrest was a set of keys with a silver Mercedes keychain. They belonged to my younger brother, Evan. I stepped back from the door and looked at the freshly painted trim, the reinforced foundation, and the restored cedar siding of the old boat repair shop that my grandfather had built in the 70s. It had an attached 2-story residential unit. After the bank foreclosed on it following my grandfather's prolonged illness and passing, the property had sat rotting, tied up in a municipal tax lien. I was the one who navigated the auctions, paid the back taxes with my savings from years of commercial contracting, and put the deed in my name. Yet, standing there on that Tuesday afternoon, I realized my family had decided my labor was merely preparation for Evan's inheritance. Evan walked out onto the porch holding a bottle of sparkling water, looking at me with the practiced, calm smile he usually reserved for his real estate clients. He didn't look surprised to see me. He leaned against the railing and told me that our parents had decided it wasn't fair for one brother to monopolize the family legacy. According to him, they had used the old sweeping power of attorney I had foolishly left with my mother years ago, back when I was working on oil rigs in the Gulf and needed her to manage my mail and file my basic taxes, to sign a quitclaim deed. They had legally transferred the property to an LLC Evan controlled. My mother stepped out behind him, her arms folded, explaining in a perfectly steady voice that I was just a contractor, while Evan was a developer. She said Evan knew how to monetize the harbor frontage, that he would turn a real profit, and that I should be proud to have done the groundwork for the family's future. I didn't yell, I didn't throw a punch, and I didn't demand they let me inside. I looked at the shiny new lock, looked at my mother's defensive posture, and simply nodded. I turned around, walked to my truck, and drove away. Over the next few weeks, I ignored their calls and texts. They expected a legal war, a dramatic explosion of sibling rivalry, or a tearful plea at a family dinner. Instead, I gave them absolute silence. I went back to my apartment in the city, took a framing job on a commercial high-rise, and waited. The thing my family never understood about my grandfather's boat shop was why the bank had been so eager to let it go at auction for a fraction of its acreage value. They saw waterfront property. I saw the soil reports. For 40 years, my grandfather had stripped marine paint, handled industrial solvents, and dumped the runoff into a gravel pit behind the shed. The soil was saturated with tributyl, heavy metals, and hydrocarbons. When I bought the property, I did it knowing it carried a massive environmental liability. I had been quietly working with a municipal inspector named Quincy to secure a brownfield remediation grant. I was doing the cleanup manually, meticulously stripping the topsoil and storing it in certified containment barrels, keeping the footprint purely residential to avoid triggering the county's commercial zoning audits. Evan didn't know any of this. He didn't do due diligence because he assumed my purchase meant the asset was clean and ready to flip. To him, I was just the blue-collar older brother who lacked a vision to build luxury condos. I needed to know exactly how far Evan had gone to secure his stolen prize, so I met with an old friend, Luke, who worked as a clerk at the county records office. We sat in a diner off the interstate, and he slid a copy of the filed paperwork across the table. Evan hadn't just transferred the deed to his LLC, he had leveraged it. He had taken out a massive commercial construction loan to demolish the boat shop and build a 4-unit luxury townhouse complex. But Evan's company was over-leveraged from previous failed projects, a fact he hid behind leased cars and tailored suits. To secure this new loan, our parents had co-signed, using their own paid-off suburban home as collateral. My mother had literally bet her retirement on Evan's vision, convinced they were reclaiming the family wealth I was supposedly squandering. I felt a hollow ache in my chest. A part of me wanted to drive to their house, shake them, and warn them about the cliff they were driving off. I had spent my entire adult life feeling guilty for being away on the rigs when my grandfather's health declined, trying to make up for it by saving his home. But seeing my forged signature on that quitclaim document, a betrayal executed with cold bureaucratic precision by the woman who raised me, killed that lingering loyalty. If I warned them now, Evan would simply pivot, declare bankruptcy in his LLC, and leave me stuck with the toxic cleanup of a property I no longer legally owned. I had to let him take full possession. I had to let him break ground. To keep up appearances, I hired a local attorney and sent a few weak cease and desist letters demanding the property back. It was a calculated retreat. I needed Evan to feel pressured, to believe I was desperately trying to stop him before he could realize his grand vision. The letters worked perfectly. Driven by arrogance and the desire to prove he had beaten me, Evan rushed the demolition. He bypassed the standard environmental surveys, claiming the site was pre-approved residential, and brought in heavy excavators to tear down the old shed and rip up the foundation. He dug straight into the contaminated gravel pit. The moment the excavators breached the toxic soil, the chemical odor hit the neighboring properties. Quincy, the municipal inspector I'd been working with, received complaints from the harbor master about an oily sheen leaching into the water. Quincy arrived at the site and immediately issued a stop work order. But Evan, confident in his lawyer and his loans, assumed it was a standard bureaucratic delay. He ignored the initial warnings, pouring concrete for his new foundation over the disturbed soil. The trap finally closed 3 months after the locks were changed. Evan's lawyer called for a formal mediation meeting to settle my title dispute, hoping to force me to drop my claim so they could clear the title for their construction draw. The meeting was held in a sterile conference room downtown. Evan wore a custom navy suit, looking irritated but triumphant. My parents sat beside him, refusing to make eye contact with me. My mother gripped her purse tightly, while my father stared at the mahogany table, looking exhausted. Evan's attorney slid a settlement agreement across the table. They offered me $20,000, a fraction of what I had spent on the back taxes alone, in exchange for a full release of all claims against the property and the LLC. Evan leaned back in his leather chair and told me to take the money, saying it was more than I deserved for just painting a few walls. He said the family was moving forward, and I could either get on board or get out of the way. I looked at the document, picked up a pen, and signed it without a word. Evan blinked, clearly disoriented by how easily I had surrendered. My mother exhaled a long, shaky breath, muttering something about how this was for the best. Evan's lawyer looked pleased and began organizing his folders. But my attorney calmly stated that there was one final matter to address before we concluded the transfer of liabilities. He pulled a thick, sealed manila envelope from his briefcase. He explained that since I was officially relinquishing all ties to the property, the ongoing municipal and federal correspondence regarding the site needed to be formally handed over to the legal owner on record. Evan's lawyer opened the envelope. He pulled out a stack of documents bearing the letterhead of the Environmental Protection Agency, accompanied by municipal zoning enforcement notices. The silence in the room changed texture as Evan's lawyer read the first page. The color drained from his face. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his eyes darting frantically across the paragraphs. Evan, noticing his lawyer's panic, snatched the papers. The documents detailed a comprehensive environmental assessment. Because Evan had illegally demolished the containment site, disturbed toxic subsoil without a permit, and allowed chemical runoff to reach protected harbor waters, the site was now classified as a federal hazard. The brownfield grant I had secured was voided the moment he began unpermitted commercial development. The notice outlined mandatory, immediate remediation. The estimated cost for soil removal, water treatment and municipal fines was just over $1.2 million. And because my mother had used that forged power of attorney to transfer the deed to Evans LLC, and Evan had willingly accepted it and commenced construction, the liability rested entirely on him. Evan's voice cracked as he demanded to know what this was. He accused me of setting him up, of fabricating the reports. I sat quietly, watching the realization wash over him. I told him I had been doing the cleanup by hand, legally and slowly to save our grandfather's land. I told him I had tried to handle the burden so the family wouldn't have to. But since he was the developer, and since our parents trusted his vision, the burden was now his. My mother snatched the papers from Evan's hands. She didn't understand the environmental jargon, but she understood the bolded numbers at the bottom of the final page. She looked at Evan, asking him how they were going to pay for this, reminding him that their house was tied to his construction loan. Evan couldn't answer. His professional facade collapsed, revealing the terrified, over-leveraged fraud he had always been. His lawyer quietly began packing his briefcase, murmuring that he needed to review their retainer agreement. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the conference room. No one tried to stop me. In the weeks that followed, the consequences compounded with brutal efficiency. The county seized the property. Evans LLC was pierced during the federal investigation because the foundational deed transfer was based on a fraudulent use of my defunct power of attorney. However, because Evan and my parents had knowingly executed the fraud to secure the loan, the bank didn't forgive the debt. They called it in. Evan filed for personal bankruptcy. My parents were forced to sell their suburban home to cover the construction loan default and avoid federal fraud charges, moving into a small rented apartment on the edge of town. They tried to reach out to me once, leaving a voicemail asking for financial help, pleading that we were still family. I didn't return the call. The cost of my victory was the permanent erasure of my family, a price I paid the moment I realized they viewed my ruin as an acceptable stepping stone for their ambition. I never went back to the harbor. I took a contract restoring a historical brick foundry in a different state. Every morning, I wake up early, put on my boots, and walk through the dusty, quiet halls of a building that is slowly being brought back to life. I don't own it, and I don't want to. I just do the work, collect my pay, and enjoy the absolute silence of a life where the only things I rebuild are the things I choose to. The peace I found in the rhythmic strike of a masonry hammer against antique brick didn't last. For 6 months, the foundry restoration in the neighboring state had been my sanctuary. I had traded the salty, chemical-laced air of the harbor for the smell of mortar and damp earth. I thought the silence from my family meant they had finally accepted the reality of their choices. I was wrong. Desperation, I soon learned, doesn't breed acceptance. It breeds a vicious, grasping need to find a scapegoat. It was a rainy Thursday when a process server walked onto the active job site, his clean dress shoes sinking into the mud. He handed me a thick envelope wrapped in a rubber band. The moment I felt the weight of the paper, the familiar tension returned to my jaw. It was a civil lawsuit filed in federal court. Evan wasn't just declaring bankruptcy, he was suing me for fraudulent entrapment, intentional infliction of financial ruin, and environmental sabotage. Reading through the summons in the cab of my truck, I realized just how far my mother and brother were willing to go. Their new narrative was a masterpiece of revisionist history. Evan's new attorney, a bottom feeder who specialized in aggressive, baseless litigation to force settlements, claimed that the soil contamination wasn't from our grandfather's boatwork in the 70s. Instead, they alleged that I, bitter over being rightfully removed from the deed, had intentionally dumped industrial solvents onto the property after the locks were changed, deliberately poisoning the land to frame Evan and trigger the EPA fines. The most sickening part wasn't the lie itself, it was the sworn affidavit attached to the back. My mother had signed a statement claiming she had visited the property weeks before the deed transfer and noted the soil was completely undisturbed and odor-free. She perjured herself, formally going on the record to say, I had threatened to ruin Evan if he ever touched the property. She was willing to send her oldest son to federal prison for environmental terrorism, just to spare her youngest son from the financial grave he had dug for himself. I called my attorney back in my home state. He sounded exhausted when he answered. He explained that while their case was entirely circumstantial and absurd on its face, the sheer magnitude of the EPA liability made it incredibly dangerous. If Evan's lawyer could convince a civil jury that there was even a 50% chance I had exacerbated the contamination, the $1.2 million burden would shift entirely back to me, compounded by punitive damages. They didn't need proof. They just needed to cast enough doubt on my manual cleanup efforts to make me look like a spiteful saboteur. My attorney warned me that Evan had subpoenaed Quincy, the municipal inspector I had originally worked with. I knew Quincy was an honest man, but he was a city employee nearing retirement, notoriously risk-averse. When I tried to call him, his number was disconnected. He had been placed on administrative leave pending the federal investigation, effectively gagging my only official witness. I was entirely isolated. I had to pack my tools, leave the foundry project in the hands of my foreman, and drive back to the state I had sworn never to return to. The drive took 14 hours, every mile grinding down the fragile peace I had built. I rented a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city, avoiding any places where I might run into my family. My first objective was to find definitive chronological proof that the heavy metals and tributyltin had been in that soil for decades, completely neutralizing their claim of recent sabotage. But there was a massive problem. When my grandfather died, the bank had foreclosed so quickly that almost all of his old business records, the invoices, the purchase orders for the marine paint, the chemical disposal logs, were lost. Or so I thought. I tracked down Luke, my friend at the county records office, who agreed to meet me at a dimly lit sports bar far from the harbor. Luke looked nervous. He told me that Evan had been aggressively auditing the city's environmental archives, trying to find any loophole. But Luke had noticed something else. During the discovery phase of Evan's bankruptcy filing, a list of assets had been submitted. Among the remaining items stored in my parents' rented apartment was a collection of bankers' boxes labeled estate documents. My blood ran cold. When my grandfather's health was failing, my mother had swooped in and cleared out his home office, claiming she was organizing his medical bills. I realized then that she had taken his business ledgers. She had possessed the historical proof of the contamination all along. She knew exactly what was in that soil because she had the receipts for every barrel of solvent my grandfather ever bought. She had watched me spend a year carefully cleaning it up, allowed Evan to steal the property under the guise of it being safe, and was now actively hiding the evidence that would clear my name. I couldn't just ask her for them. If she knew I was looking for the ledgers, she would destroy them. I needed to access that rented apartment. I needed to secure those boxes before the first deposition, which was scheduled in less than 2 weeks. The strategy I had to employ now couldn't rely on silence or passive retreat. I was no longer just defending my grandfather's legacy. I was fighting for my own freedom. I couldn't just kick the door down. Committing a felony to prove my innocence would only hand Evan the exact criminal leverage he needed to finalize my ruin. I had to use the system that Evan and my mother thought they had mastered. I sat in my cheap motel room, staring at the ceiling, and mapped out the legal architecture of Evan's collapse. He was in the middle of a federal bankruptcy proceeding. The federal bankruptcy court requires absolute transparency regarding all assets, liabilities, and historical records tied to the debtor. Because Evans LLC had claimed my grandfather's property as a primary asset, any estate documents related to that property were legally subject to discovery by the bankruptcy trustee. I called my attorney at dawn. When I explained what Luke had found in the initial bankruptcy disclosures regarding the banker's boxes at my parents' apartment, the exhaustion vanished from his voice. He moved with ruthless speed. Instead of fighting the civil suit directly, he filed an emergency ex parte motion in federal bankruptcy court. We alerted the court-appointed trustee that the debtor and his co-signers were in possession of historical estate documents directly related to the massive EPA liability attached to the bankrupt estate. We argued that these documents were at imminent risk of destruction. The federal judge, already irritated by the messy, fraudulent nature of Evans LLC, didn't hesitate. He issued an immediate preservation and seizure order. 2 days before my scheduled deposition, a court-appointed auditor, flanked by 2 county sheriff's deputies, knocked on the door of my parents' rented apartment. According to the police report I read later, my mother tried to refuse them entry. She screamed that it was personal property, just old photographs and medical bills, but a federal seizure order doesn't care about a mother's panic. They walked past her, located the boxes in the bedroom closet, and took all of them into federal custody. The deposition took place in a windowless conference room in the basement of the county courthouse. A red light blinked on the stenographer's recording equipment. Evan sat across from me, flanked by his aggressive new lawyer, while my mother sat a few feet behind them, gripping her purse in that familiar defensive posture. They didn't know about the seizure. The federal audit had been filed under seal in the bankruptcy case, entirely separate from this civil circus. Evan's lawyer started the recording and immediately went on the offensive. He spent 2 hours badgering me, accusing me of sneaking onto the property under the cover of darkness, carrying drums of toxic chemicals to destroy his client's livelihood. He leaned across the table, demanding I confess to the sabotage. My attorney let him rant. He let my mother nod in agreement with every wild accusation. Then, when the lawyer finally paused to take a breath, my attorney reached into his briefcase. He didn't pull out a sealed envelope this time. He pulled out a thick, cracked leather ledger, its edges stained with 40-year-old motor oil. My mother gasped. The sound was sharp, involuntary, and loud enough to make the stenographer flinch. My attorney slid the ledger across the table. He calmly explained that it had been recovered by a federal auditor, directly from my mother's closet. He opened it to a bookmarked page from October of 1978. It was my grandfather's meticulous handwritten inventory. It detailed the purchase of 3 industrial drums of Tributilton marine paint, alongside heavy metal degreasers and hazardous solvents. He turned to another page from 1982, showing a hand-drawn map of the property, explicitly labeling the gravel pit behind the shed as the chemical runoff basin. Evan stared at the yellowed pages, his mouth slightly open. He looked back at my mother, who was now trembling violently, her eyes darting toward the door as if she could simply walk away from the reality closing in on her. My attorney looked directly into the camera and stated for the record that my mother had knowingly possessed these documents when she signed a sworn affidavit claiming the soil was clean and undisturbed. He pointed out that she had committed blatant perjury in a federal civil filing to frame me for a crime I didn't commit, all to shield her youngest son from the consequences of his own theft. He added that the bankruptcy trustee was currently forwarding copies of these ledgers to the EPA and the federal prosecutor's office, as they proved the LLC had attempted to discharge a known historical environmental hazard through fraudulent means. The silence that followed was absolute. Evan's lawyer didn't try to object. He didn't try to spin the narrative. He slowly pulled his hands back from the table, physically distancing himself from his clients. He knew that pushing the case forward now wouldn't just result in a loss. It would result in him being implicated in suborning perjury. He asked to go off the record, stood up, and told Evan they needed to speak outside immediately. The civil lawsuit was withdrawn with prejudice the following morning. The federal machinery, however, was just waking up. Because my mother had lied on an affidavit, she was indicted for perjury and obstruction of justice. To avoid prison time, she had to plead guilty and accept 3 years of heavily monitored probation, permanently destroying whatever social standing she had left in her community. Evan's bankruptcy was converted to a Chapter 11, meaning his debts were not forgiven, just restructured. He will spend the rest of his working life having a portion of his wages garnished to pay off the EPA remediation fines. The property itself was eventually seized by the municipality, condemned, and paved over to become a municipal parking lot. I didn't stick around to watch the final pieces fall. I didn't need to hear an apology, and I certainly didn't offer forgiveness. I packed my truck, checked out of the motel, and drove back across state lines. I returned to the historical brick foundry. The air there is cold, clean, and smells of wet stone. I put my tool belt back on and picked up my masonry hammer. Sometimes my foreman asks me about my family, noticing I never take calls during the holidays. I just tell him I don't have one anymore, and then I go back to work. I spend my days carefully removing decayed mortar, cleaning the strong surviving bricks, and setting them back into place with my own hands. It is exhausting, quiet, and completely mine.
Texto colado. Editar. The infographic presents the story as more than a conflict over property. It is a study of betrayal, entitlement, silence, and delayed justice. At the center is a man who restores a family property with his own money, labor, and technical knowledge because he wants to preserve his grandfather's legacy. His family, however, treats that sacrifice as something they are free to take. By using an old power of attorney to transfer the deed to the younger brother, they turn trust into a weapon and years of work into fuel for someone else's ambition. Psychologically, the story shows how entitlement distorts moral judgment. The mother and younger brother convince themselves that the transfer is justified because they believe he has greater business potential. The protagonist is dismissed as merely a contractor, while his brother is praised as a developer. This reveals a family dynamic in which practical labor is undervalued and appearance is mistaken for competence. Favoritism deepens the injustice because the parents protect the younger son while expecting the older one to accept the loss. The infographic also presents silence as strategic control. When the protagonist discovers the changed locks and fraudulent transfer, he does not react impulsively. His silence is not weakness. It gives him time to understand the legal, environmental, and financial consequences of the betrayal. Instead of seeking immediate satisfaction, he allows documents, inspections, and official procedures to reveal the truth. His patience becomes powerful because his brother acts from arrogance. Believing he has already won, he skips due diligence, rushes construction, disturbs contaminated soil, and creates a liability greater than the property's value. Socially, the story shows how family loyalty can be manipulated to excuse abuse. The mother uses the idea of family legacy to justify decisions that benefit one child and destroy another. The family future becomes a disguise for greed, favoritism, and financial exploitation. The parents even risk their own home to support the younger son, showing how emotional bias can push an entire family toward ruin. The environmental problem represents a hidden reality that appearances cannot erase. The protagonist understands the land because he studied it carefully. His brother sees only valuable waterfront property. By ignoring surveys, permits, and warnings, he turns a manageable cleanup into a federal hazard. When the family later tries to blame the protagonist, old business ledgers prove that the contamination had existed for decades and exposed the mother's false testimony. The final lesson is not that revenge creates peace. The protagonist wins legally, but the victory costs him his family. His true success is recovering control over his own life. He leaves the harbor, returns to honest restoration work, and chooses a quieter existence where his effort cannot be claimed by people who do not respect him. The infographic connects justice with personal boundaries. Protecting documents, questioning unhealthy family expectations, and refusing to rescue others from the consequences of their choices become acts of self-preservation. In the end, peace does not come from proving everyone wrong. It comes from rebuilding a life that betrayal can no longer control.